All right, and welcome back to WBCR 88.3 The Saint. I'm Justin Kenny as always. And with me tonight, we have a very special Siena guest, Mr. Travis Brodbeck. So, Travis, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Justin. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you. So, before we get into the main gist of everything I want to talk to you tonight, why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I have the grace here of serving as the Associate Director of Data Management at the Siena College Research Institute. But how I got here is actually because I was a Siena student. So I came here in 2013 as a double major studying accounting and economics, got my master's in accounting, and I started working full-time at the Research Institute in 2018 when we did a live polling with the New York Times across 95 different congressional districts. So I also teach here in the accounting department. So it's so great to be able to give back to my alma mater, but also to work on really interesting work.
Nice. As somebody who works in tax, and I can tell you that accounting is such a there's a lot more to accounting than people think. But
Absolutely. There's so much strategy and decision making that goes into it rather than just bookkeeping, as many people think about.
yeah, and I've also, before we get to the polling and stuff, I got one question for you about accounting education. Because I know for historians, they hate with a passion the way history is taught. I've seen this a little bit with accountants that I've worked at, where they tend to say that the way accounting is taught in schools versus the way accounting is in the real world is completely different. I wanted to kind of see your thoughts on that since you teach accounting.
Absolutely. So I have the benefit of teaching managerial and cost accounting, which is a lot more internal focus, a lot more ideas of how can we use data to convert that into information and use that information to make better decisions. So in my courses, as much as I can, I try to incorporate projects and hands-on assignments and simulations because I feel that testing is great when you're preparing for the CPA exam, but is not great for preparing for the workforce. So I 100% agree. We need to be more hands-on, more simulation-based, and more community-based research and practice. So bringing in community partners with real accounting problems and having students work on those would bring us eons into the future when it comes to the pedagogy of accounting.
Yeah. All right. So now we got the accounting out of the way. Why don't we move into the polls? So obviously, I mean, I myself worked as a caller this election cycle, and you yourself work for SCRI in a different department. You're not a caller yourself. But going into the election, it was viewed as a coin flip. It could go either way. It could go Kamala or it could go Trump. Um, but obviously, it ended up being an electoral college landslide, and Trump won by about 2 million votes. So, for somebody like yourself who works in the polling industry, do you think the polls got it wrong? Do you think they got it right? Do you think there was something that people are misreading? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a conversation I've been having with a lot of folks. So first and foremost, I actually want to clarify how I view this election. I view this one as decisive, but not a landslide. Yes, President-elect Trump had won all the battleground states, but he didn't win them by a lot. So when I think about landslides, I think about 350 plus electoral college votes or in the 400s. And we usually see that, we're seeing that with Herbert Hoover, 2000, 19 to 28. Roosevelt did very well during his years. Reagan and even Clinton did pretty well in the Electoral College. So, not necessarily a landslide, but I would consider this definitely decisive. Voters spoke and the electorate had their way. When it comes from a polling perspective, I'm actually very exuberant. Because a lot of folks always worry about election day, and I knew going into it that our polls are going to be accurate, and boy, were they. So we actually just measured our mean absolute error, and when you look at the battleground states, that was 3.15%, so well within the margin of error. So we're proud of that. When you look at the U.S., the last national poll we did, comparing our poll results to the actual, it was 1.65%. So when you think about polling as a snapshot in time, as a way to put your thermometer into the water to get a decent read on the temperature, we did exactly what polling could do from the position that it is. Again, we only collect samples of 1,000, 2,000, sometimes 3,000 people, and aggregate that and generalize that to the entire electorate. So over 154 million votes were cast in this election, and some are still being counted. but we came in within 1.6% of the actual result. And when you think about that, that is just an amazing representation of the scientific method of Poland being refined year over year.
Yeah, because excuse me, a lot of people when they look at the Electoral College, they think like, oh, Trump won in a landslide. Now, obviously, every state except for two was winner take all. I've always been a fan more or less of going to proportional electoral votes for a few reasons. Um, but that wouldn't have changed anything this time around. It would have changed things in 2000 and 2016, but not this time around or 2020. But when you look at, and the main reason I'm stating this is because, as you point out, a lot of the battleground states that Trump won, I mean, he swept them. But I looked at the numbers this afternoon at work before I did this call with you, and they all seem to be within like 3 points or 2 points percentage wise. So
Yep.
they're a lot closer than a lot of people tend to think.
100%.
And
So
it's
the
oh yeah.
I think that the thing that was also interesting there was in the polls, especially ours, we said that the Democratic senators would outperform Vice President Harris, and they did. So on different ways you read it, you can continue to see that how the polls also performed. We saw it in the polls that the abortion was one of the top three issues, and abortion referendums, 7 of the 10 that expanded abortion access or abortion rights did pass despite Harris losing both the popular vote and the electoral college vote.
Yeah, and I mean another thing with that is that I mean I don't remember any scale of likability besides maybe unfavorable being used in the polls. Now, granted, most people are just going to say "f you" when I call them, which I would say I get told probably go "f myself" like 10 times a night when I do the calls. But there didn't really seem to be, besides the unfavorable rating, um, about how people liked the candidate. And I mean, it's a stupid reason to vote for somebody, but it's a reason that a lot of people vote for somebody. Do you think SCRI measured that in a good way, or do you think there is ways to kind of improve that?
I'm really happy you asked that because we did do a couple series, especially with Joe Biden. But then when Vice President Harris was put into the race, we asked people a bunch of different traits of do you think Donald Trump is a strong leader? Do you think Vice President Harris is a strong leader? Do you think they care about people like you? Are they intelligent? Do they have the temperament to be an effective president? And we found that there was some variation in what the voters viewed. So, for example, is intelligent appeared that Harris had an advantage. Is a strong leader, Trump had an advantage. Cares about people like you, Harris had an advantage there. So we actually partnered with another organization called Cloud Research. And in addition to our quantitative polling that we do via telephone only, they mimicked our instrument on a web panel and they did AI-driven in-depth interviews. So as they were asking people, who do you think is a strong leader? They asked folks to elaborate, and they were able to use voice to text or their keyboard to go into much more depth rather than choose this response category. And what we found was, especially when we think about the strong leader question, is people did say that Trump was a strong leader, but then they elaborated and said, "Oh, well, just because he's a strong leader does not mean that that is always advantageous." So they mentioned in a lot of the responses that he is sometimes too stubborn, or at least they viewed him to be too stubborn, to possibly listen to advisors, subject matter experts, and being a strong leader may not help when you need to have sensitive negotiations on international foreign policy issues, for example, or very divisive domestic politics. So it is interesting that we did work to both measure that both quantitatively and qualitatively, and we're excited to be preparing some of that research to hopefully present at the American Association for Public Opinion Research Conference in this upcoming May in St. Louis. So more to come on our exploration of that topic.
Nice, because another thing that I mean, like, I was not a Trump voter this time around. I went the other way for a variety of reasons, but I still remember even saying to myself before she became president or before she became vice president, like, I can't stand her. And a lot of people kind of felt that same way. Do you think, although people also say they can't stand Trump, but Trump still has this legion of followers, some of who I would say practically worship him. And I guess you can't really look into the dichotomy of that with polls, but is there a way that you kind of can see that or look at that?
Definitely. So when we looked at a variety of questions, so for example, favorability, Joe Biden was not doing well before the debate. He much did poorly after the debate, and then Harris had this bump. So she had a hire don't know before the dropout, and then after she became the candidate, she had this what we call a sugar high. People started tuning into her. She got a lot of positive media and not a lot of pushback, not as many negative interviews. But after some time, her negative favorability started to creep back upwards, and she eventually ended up underwater, just like President Trump. I think what we saw there was a lot of voters still didn't know who Vice President Harris was, and there wasn't a lot of time for her to introduce herself. And we now know that the traditional gatekeepers of information, which were used to be your newspapers, both print and online, and your conventional mainstream media, television, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, they are losing to what this new fragmented media scape of podcasters and TikTok influencers and you name it. People can make their own political blog in just a couple minutes. So we saw that voters were not gonna be able to receive the same message from a candidate. So these candidates tried to spread out and try to get their favorability up. But it actually just resulted in not coalition building and expanding your base, but actually just trying to drive up turnout within a base. And that generally doesn't win elections, and it also doesn't allow people to fall behind a candidate for a variety of reasons. So the two issues that people said that they supported Vice President Harris for was because of abortion and democracy. And those two issues, as important they may be to a lot of folks, those are not as immediate as today's problems as the economy and immigration. And though both those two issues, a lot of voters, whether they liked President Trump or not, said that he would do a better job on those issues. And Harris had a chance to fix immigration as she was named the immigration, the border czar, and voters saw her performance for the last 4 years and said she didn't do what she was tasked to do. So therefore, they were demanding change and looking for a different direction for the country.
Yeah, you also left me a lot to unpack with your answer there, but there is a lot. Like I'll try to do bullet points with this because you did leave me a lot to unpack. But I know is that like Trump was doing like these interviews with like Joe Rogan, Theo Von, all these different other ones. Joe Rogan endorsed him at the 11th hour pretty much. And a lot of people tend to think that gave him a little bit of a bump. One person said that he didn't vote for Harris because she didn't go on Joe Rogan and other things, from what I recall. Like also too, another thing I wanted to tell you about is that when I was doing the calls and we were asking about what issues are important to you, I came across a few voters who said their main issue was putting Trump back in the White House or keeping Kamala, aka a crazy lady, out of the White House. And before I unpack the rest of that, I kind of want to get your response to that.
Yeah. So negative partisanship is actually why campaigns spend so much money. So if you turn on the TV during an election season, all you hear is these very scary commercials that say this candidate messed up this policy. This is the implications of it. You cannot vote for them. And then the other candidate says, I approve this message. So, and that's where a lot of the dollars were spent in all these campaigns. It's not on the rallies and the logistics. It's really about advertising and trying to get people out there. So voters who are less informed or less tuned in to the election, the most information they receive about either candidate is negative information. So it's hard for voters to go to the ballot box or to talk to an interviewer on the phone and really dissect why they like or dislike when they've been given so much information of why to dislike somebody. As we know, a lot of people don't tune into politics maybe as much as you and I do. Most folks are just trying to, work their 9 to 5, have a nice time with their family and have good health. To be a political junkie, it takes a lot of time and investment. I think about people who are big sports fans. Staying up on your who's on the roster, who's doing well, who's injured. That takes a lot of time and investment that most people don't have. So when you're limited of, your scope of this person is just because a couple commercials, a couple flyers you received in the mail, and a couple things that you heard from your friends, it makes it hard for voters to really say which issue is most important to them, rather than I
Yeah.
heard about that one candidate. I know that I disagree with what they've done, so I need to vote for the other person.
Yeah, I mean, I also did have one person when I asked him what news source he uses the most, he said word of mouth.
Hmm. It's a,
Like,
it's very interesting.
yeah, he didn't say like CNN, Breitbart, or whatever. He just said word of mouth. I was like, what? He was like, yeah, I go off what people tell me. I was like, okay. Uh-huh.
Sounds like peer pressure. If you go back to middle school, right?
Yeah.
Would you follow your friend if they walked off a bridge? Apparently, that one person you spoke to said, the people they trust, their own personal cabinet, which is their friends, their family, and their coworkers.
Or as presidents will call it, their kitchen cabinet. Um,
Yes.
it's funny you bring up, I got two things I want to talk to you about. It's funny you bring up negative campaigning, and obviously the main election I think about a lot with negative campaigning is 1988 with Dukakis and Bush, and obviously Lee Atwater and them. Now, obviously, that was also an election about how a presidential candidate could arguably frame the issues that are at bay with the election. Now, Bush lost in 92, also because Carvel basically pulled it's the economy stupid, and Bush had the whole entire thing with the grocery scanner where he's amazed because, I mean, he hadn't probably shopped for his own groceries in like at least 12 years since he became vice president, or even longer than that because he was a high ranking official. But, I mean, a lot of people nowadays get their groceries delivered in probably 10, 20 years. I'm one of the same people. I could probably be seeing myself doing the same exact thing. Like, this is what grocery stores are like. But now obviously everybody remembers the Willie Horton ad, and this is a quick little side note tangent. Quick little the Willie Horton ad, and then Mike Dukakis being asked on the first question of that debate, being like, if Kitty Dukakis, your wife, was raped and murdered, would you favor the death penalty? And he came out and said no, even though it was in that election. That was kind of the stupidest answer you could do because that was another one of the tough on crime elections. And I actually got to have Dukakis on my show one time, and I got to actually ask him, "Do you regret answering the question that way?" And he said, "No, I don't. I have no regrets on that." Even though that question probably could have changed his pathway. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, can you see through polls how kind of an election is being framed?
I think so. So, for example, let's go back to New York in 2022. Former Governor Cuomo resigned. Governor Kathy Hochul took over, and we were getting our way out of the pandemic. And New York State was one of the hardest states hit by the pandemic. We were basically ground zero. So there was a lot of focus on recovery, but also a lot of enthusiasm about what's going on at the federal level. For example, the CHIPS Act and Micron coming up to Rochester. If you think about funding for veterans through the PACT Act, there was a lot more emphasis on what about 9/11 survivors as well, trying to making sure that those benefits were maintained through congressional act as well. So there was a lot of action, a lot of focus on the future. But then Lee Zeldin comes in and says, look at how bad New York has done on the bail reform. And he was able, and also immigration for that matter, and he was able to change the conversation from, escaping the pandemic and recovering to look how bad New York State policy is. And so I think him completing a really good job on changing the agenda, really setting the conversation to the flaws of the Democratic policies that was set by the legislature and the governor he was able to change the election and get very close to the governorship. And now he's been nominated to be EPA director head there. So it's interesting to see that, negative partisanship can actually change the entire conversation of what the government is focused on and what it should be doing for its constituents.
Yeah, Zeldin is probably the Republicans' best chance of winning the state house in Albany since Pataki, probably. And
I would agree with that.
and what's funny about New York, and I had this discussion with Botticelli, or that's his correct name, the former Obama drug czar who was a Siena grad. And we had this kind of discussion how New York is a weird state because it's arguably the bluest of the blue state. Like Albany is the longest tenured city in America with single party rule, pretty much. And what's weird about it is that you go across the board to Massachusetts. Massachusetts will flip flop its governors every single time. Republican governor, Democrat. Right now they have Democrat. Before it was Charlie Baker, then it was Deval Patrick, then it was Mitt Romney.
Hmm.
But New York, for the last 100 years, has only had three Republican governors. Now, all three have flirted with or became part of the federal government. Pataki ran in 2016, was also almost Bush's VP. Nelson Rockefeller was Ford's VP, and Dewey ran against Truman. But what's weird about New York is that everybody thinks New York is very progressive and liberal. But if you look at it, New York's arguably conservative on a lot of issues. Like we were the last state to legalize UFC,
Yeah.
gay marriage. If three Republican senators did not change their vote, that bill would not have passed. I mean, Roy McDonald also lost his seat after that. Marijuana legalization, always a fight on that, even though now it is legalized thanks to Cuomo. But you look at a lot of these issues, there's always been a lot of blowback with these. And I mean, New York, for being liberal, is oddly conservative. I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that theory.
Absolutely. And I agree with you and I'll bring it to something that we did as part of one of the courses we teach through the Siena College Research Institute, our community research and consultant. Last year, we did a survey on environmental attitudes, support for public policy, and people's behaviors. And one thing that we found was we asked about the Plastic Packaging and Reduction Act. We asked about questions about changing the state public service commission law that no longer charges people for new hookups. So if you're a customer of National Grid, for example, on your bill, you're being charged to maintain the grid, but also help pay for the new connections through the HEAT Act. So we asked all these questions, and overwhelming support of public opinion says that yes, we should pass these laws. It's good for maintaining our agreement with the the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. However, the legislature still has not passed those laws. They continue to wrestle over it. Another example is the congestion pricing plan that Governor Hochul, in the last midnight hour, decided to put on pause and now is being advocated to restate. So there is a lot of power that the minority party has had in New York State, and I don't know why that happens in the Capitol building when you have such a large supermajority. But no matter what, legislatures in the state and the governor are concerned about the blowback of these issues. So they speak a lot of progressive talk, but they actually don't pass as much legislation as you point
Yeah,
out to actually meet that talk.
yeah, because I remember my uncle used to be the chief legal guy for the Senate majority when it was with the Republicans. Now this was back with the IDC and everything, the Independent Democratic Council, that were Democrats that caucused with the Republicans. Um, but he was talking about how this was right after the Democrats finally won the majority in the Senate. And he was talking about how they were just like, oh, yeah, like, why don't vote for us? We'll be great. And he goes like, yeah, they're not even in the same book. They're not even on the same chapter as each other. And then, like, they now have all three of the quote unquote men in the room, although now it's two women, one guy in the room, but they just can't agree on things. And it's
Yeah.
weird, but it, it's just I don't know what it is. Is that the New York Democratic Party is more conservative than the rest of the party nationwide, or something else? But it's weird.
One thing I noticed about the Democratic Party compared to other parties, and we also have like the Working Families Party, the Greens, and many others, but the Democratic Party has such a wide coalition. And when you have a wide coalition with a bunch of intersectionalities of different races, educations, income backgrounds, regional, priorities, you start to have so many people saying we should go in different directions. And I think to your point, even though they have the power to make incremental progress, they again they speak these bigger plans. And they actually argue over all these details of the big plans rather than saying what can we agree with, what do we find our own possibility of passing something that makes almost everybody happy. So it is interesting that the diversity of the
Yeah.
party and the different, Speaker Hasty versus the Senate Majority Leader Andrew Stewart Cousins versus Governor Hochul, how they approach each one of these policy issues differently. And I think the New York State budget is a great example of how poorly they are communicating and how poorly that they are being able to pass, state law. We have to pass the budget. We should pass the budget on time, and they were unable to do that for multiple years in a row.
Yeah, and I mean, I think about it as like the New York Democratic Party kind of being the New York version of the National Republican Party, whereas the Democrats are have been shooting themselves in the foot repeatedly throughout the Trump era on a lot of different things, whether it be the whole entire Merrick Garland situation with Scalia, to now like Amy Coney Barrett and all these different other things that have happened besides the Supreme Court. I mean, not John Oliver, John Stewart recently did an entire episode of the Daily Show basically showing like how bad of an opposition party the Democrats are. But then you got the funny thing where it's just like the Democrats don't need, or the Republicans don't need the Democrats to be an opposition party because they're their own damn opposition party. And like, if you think about it, like I always point this out to people, ever since 1994, when the Republicans finally won back the House after 50 years or 40 years between 1954 and 1994, both parties have held the House two different times. How many speakers have the Democrats had during those two times?
Well, they had Nancy Pelosi, really, right? That's the only one I
Yes.
can think of.
How many did the Republicans have?
Oh, I mean, we had Boehner, we had Paul Ryan, if I remember correctly, and then we had Mike Johnson, Kevin McCarthy, and I think there are a few
Newt
others. I'm just
Gingrich,
yep.
Dennis Hastert. Republicans are always fighting with each other. Now, somehow Mitch McConnell was able to stay in there so long. But now we have also John Thune. But Thune is also, like, right now showing that he has a big backbone to Trump, it seems. But we'll see how long, if that lasts long. But from what happened with Gates might give a lot of people a sigh of relief that Republicans probably are going to continue on with their infighting.
I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene is still in the House, and she was a close ally with Gates. And I wonder if they will see the same possible, conflict that we saw within the Republican Party. Not enjoying when Speaker Johnson works with Democrats to pass appropriation bills, for example.
Yeah, and this will be the last thing I'll say on it, then I'll move on. But like Trump being the king of the party, pretty much being the old school party boss that we thought was dead. Even with him being in that light, there still are people fighting against him and pulling significant punches against him. Now, whether that be that Trump isn't like a Robert Byrd or a Mitch McConnell, where he knows the nature of Washington, he knows how everything works, so they're very easy to pull just a minor jab will do significant damage to him, or just that's just nature of the party, of the Republican Party being a far more ideological party versus a coalitional party like Democrats are. So I don't know, but I digress now. We've kind of gone off. But one thing I want to ask you about too, and especially since you are a pollster in some ways, is we always see this where Republicans are able to market themselves as the party of law and order, the party of the economy, the party of national security. Democrats are pretty much the party of social issues, it seems. But most of the issues that will impact people the most seem to be marketed by the Republicans, at least from my view of things. With yourself looking at the polls and everything you encounter, do you think that's true? And if so, why? And if not, how so?
I think what voters view and perspective of which party will do better or which candidate do better on the issues, what you laid out is exactly what we see in the data. So when you look at the economy, the voters say that Trump has an overwhelming, sh strength on that. He would do better on the economy. You look at immigration, he would do better on that. When you look at, the identity politics issues of abortion, transgender rights, the voters think that the Democrats would do a better job on that. But again, those tend to be more abstract or at least less immediate problems. If you think about that your house is on fire, are you going to worry about your neighbor's house or are you going to worry about yours first? Well, you want to put out the fire. So a lot of voters are choosing economy, immigration, crime, and those issues alike. And it comes down to messaging. And I can't really remember a time where Democrats were as focused on a single cohesive message as the Republicans have done year over year. So whether it's, they wanted to put in more Supreme Court judges, or they want to focus on here in New York State changing the bail reform law, and I think the Republican pressure, by Lee Zeldin did get the legislator to, take a look at the law there. And it just appears that, again, maybe it's because of the coalition nature versus the ideological nature that messaging is much more refined and much stronger for the Republicans. And I think one thing we saw this year with the Republican National Convention is uh, I'll admit it to you, but I don't read the entire party platform. I skim it. And the Republicans were able to condense it to just a few pages, if not one page, whereas the Democrats went the traditional long form website where every issue had a long explanation. There's so many issues. What is the focus of the party? And going back to most voters don't have the time to tune into all these things. I think that the idea of trying to narrow the platform to a slogan, "Make America Great Again,"
Yeah.
really resonates with voters, rather than we need to deal with the complex issue of the Middle East while both trying to get hostages out and trying to negotiate peace for a two-state solution and to stop terrorism. That just sounds too complicated, and it sounds almost unrealistic. It's to most voters. They say, there's usually one direction or another we need to go in, and there's only going to be a few limited solutions most voters think that will be successful. So I think that, being able to boil down a message into a slogan, into just one or two issues that we should prioritize, and the other issues will take the back burner, has been quite effective for the Republican Party.
Yeah. And also the politics of nostalgia, which some argue is more powerful than the politics of the future.
And
Um,
fear, for that matter, too, because if you
yeah.
think about the Republican messages, immigration is, there is an invasion was the words used, or the economy is in shambles. So those strong words do have quite a bit of impact, to your point.
Yeah, I would always find it interesting when I would talk to people in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, and these people who live far away from the border, and their main issue would be border security. Like, I mean, Shane Gillis has a joke about it where he's just like, he talks about Fox News dads. And he was just like, oh, yeah, I was living with my parents in Pennsylvania. And my dad was worried about immigrants coming and taking his job. He's like, Dad, you really think you're going to come all the way up to Pennsylvania? Be like, go to your car dealership and be, oh, so you're here for the sales job. And, and I mean, like, whether you agree with that statement or not, I always found that interesting that people so far away from the border, and when they were talking border, they weren't talking the Canadian border, they were talking the Mexican border.
Yeah. Well,
Um, oh, sorry.
it's funny that you mentioned that, just not to go on a tangent. I do know that the Canadian border, there was a recent report by the local sheriffs there and Department of Homeland Security that there are actually quite a bit of border crossings coming from the Canadian border as well. Just that
Yeah,
doesn't get any of the news that we see that the southern border gets.
yeah. I mean, yeah, if you just look at conservative media, the southern borders talked almost every 5 minutes.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two questions I want to really ask you because we are getting close on time. The first one being, for years, it has seemed, especially during the entire Trump era, that the argument has been made that white suburban women are the most influential indecisive voter base where it kind of seems like if you're able to win them, you can win the election. Do you think that's true? And do you think it's been true the entire Trump era? Do you think it's been true up to this past election? What's your thoughts on that? And if it's not white suburban women, what would you make the argument that the most important or valuable voting bloc is?
Yeah. So I would say that my perspective looking at the poll results and when you also think about turnout, uh, it's actually the white no college vote rather than specifically white suburban women. They tend to respond less to polls, so they get picked up less. They tend not to show up in midterm elections, but they do show up when Trump is on the ballot in the presidential elections. And in 2016, the polls got it wrong because they didn't adjust their data by education. They actually overstated all these college educated votes and didn't state enough or represent enough of these white no college voters. So I think that is the voter that is of more of interest, the ones that have, especially during the Trump era, come out in larger groves and shares and able to get Donald Trump into the White House. I will say
Yeah.
though, in the midterm elections, your white suburban women are the ones who also show up. They are reliable voter bloc, and they tend to vote based on the issues that are impacting them most. So we saw in 2022 that the Democrats really didn't see the Democrats were able to fend off the red wave in all states except New York and Florida. White suburban women could be held, partially, responsible for giving Democrats such an advantage. Part of that is the abortion issue, the idea of defending democracy and institutional norms. It were some of the messages marketed towards them. So I think yes, they are an important voting bloc. But for when we discuss Trump, it appears to be that white, not no college voters are big. This year, and also we saw in the previous election cycles, Trump has done something that a lot of Democrats didn't think was possible. Was chip away at minority voters. You think about black voters, especially black men, but also Latino voters and Latino men for there. And they, at a much more rate that anyone really anticipated if you would have asked them 8 years ago, they have moved towards the Republican Party, towards Trump. So that's another interesting demographic that a lot of Democrats may have, hypothetically, gotten complacent and thought those votes will always be theirs, whereas the Republicans were able to chip away at a coalition that was traditionally more Democratic.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the non-college voter, I'm not particularly sold on this whole entire demographic shift towards Republicans yet, just because A, it's only been in the Trump era, and B, it's only like really this one election that's really happening so far. I would need to see an election without Trump have that, and an election in like two or three, or maybe three or four straight elections where that happens.
Absolutely. One data point is not a trend.
Although if you talk to everybody on the news and all the opinion columns, it's, oh, the Democrat Party's dead except for people who went to college. So you and I would be like the only people who fit the demographic of those who would vote Democrat. But like it's only one election. Um, I'm still interested to see if the Democrats do an autopsy like the Republicans did. Um, we'll yet see that. But another demographic that you brought up that's interesting too is the Hispanic vote. And one thing I noticed when going into the demographics with people is that it's stated just are you Hispanic or Latino after you choose Hispanic or Latino. And one of the things I've noticed about the Hispanic population is that they're kind of like the Catholics of racial politics in some ways. They go both ways. Catholics, it's just like 50-50. The ones who follow the social teachings are more liberal. The ones who don't are more conservative. But Hispanics, you can make the argument, it kind of depends on which country is your main heritage of Hispanic or Latino. Like Cubans are notoriously more conservative, and they have been for decades. Um, but there's no polling on really going to see stuff like that. Do you see any reasoning to do that, or do you think that's kind of just me going like, oh, it's just one way, like kind of look at it a different way, I guess.
I 100% agree with you that one, Latino and Hispanic voters are not a monolith, and you do see quite a bit of variation between your Mexican Latinos, your Cuban Latinos, as you specified. Miami-Dade County is a great example in Florida of where your Cuban voters overwhelmingly supported Trump in each one of these cycles. And where you come from, and also how many generations of American, I think also has an impact. That is something I personally believe that polls have not done a great job at trying to measure. But in our New York Times Siena College polls, we did ask when we did a Latino Hispanic oversample. What type of Hispanic votes were. So Cuban, South America, from South America, like Argentina and so on and so forth. So we did, ask that question of those voters, and we could do more analysis on that and encourage folks to start asking those follow-up questions because treating people as monoliths is obviously a indicator. But is never the full story. We all know that there's much more nuance to that. Things aren't as simple as they seem, and your lived experience beyond your demographics is also another driver. So I think about families who escaped leftist policies and of hyperinflation and came to America. They definitely look at our political issues differently than folks who have been here for multiple generations and have lived comfortably in a suburban environment. And maybe Spanish is not even spoken in the household anymore. So there is so much variation, and if this demographic group continues to trend in these different directions, then it's important to give them more weight, especially as we see demographic shifts in America nationwide, but also in the different states.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Because also too, one of the things I see is that I see like of all the Hispanic and Latino people I know, it's split. But then also too, I know some white people who have Hispanics in their family. Like I know one who told me his son was marrying immigrants, so they sped up quickly because they didn't want to be worrying about if Trump was elected and having the risk of deportation. But then he was just like, I'm not voting for Trump because I don't want a racist organization threaten my son's marriage and stuff like that. But then also, one of the things that people tend to forget is that there is kind of this, I don't know if I want to say, it's kind of like a tectonic plate in some ways when it comes to immigration. Is probably the best way I can think of it, where there's this kind of rivalry between legal and illegal immigrants that people tend to forget. That everybody tends to think that all legal immigrants are okay with illegal. That's actually not the case. Where like I know of like one woman who was a Venezuelan immigrant, and she was telling me how much her and her family dislike the illegal immigrants. So they feel them as taking a shortcut. And I think that's one thing that people tend to forget within the whole entire topic of immigration. But we're coming towards the end here, and we only have a few minutes left. So I'm going to ask you one last thing, and that is obviously we've talked each other's ear off about a lot of different things, but we haven't talked about everything. With yourself being a pollster, and there's obviously a lot of things people say about polls, and there's obviously a lot of things about polls going into this election cycle. Is there anything you haven't gotten the chance to say that you want to say? And if so, now is your time.
Absolutely, and I appreciate the space. So let me first kind of do my favorite analogy here is, no one yells at the weather person, the meteorologist, when it rains when there was a 50% chance of sunshine. No one yells at the economist when the labor figures come in better than expected. People just say, oh, the numbers came in differently. So there is a lot of pressure put on pollsters, and I think people's expectations, and part of it is probably driven by how much emphasis is done in the media on these numbers, and people look at a number and say that must be true. And pollen is again a inexact but precise measurement. And we give you the margin of error for a reason. And I also want to recognize that the margin of error is based on the entire sample, that electorate. When you start to slice and dice across the different demographic variables, the margin of error gets larger because we're talking about only 500 men and 500 females rather than 1,000 people. So, the margin of error definitely gets bigger there. So I also want to say that we pollsters love the actual data. Whether we did a great job in a season or a not a great job, and again, we did great. We've been named America's most accurate pollster 2 years in a row. I think we're in the running for number three for the third year. But we have a annual conference in May, the American Association for Public Opinion Research conference, where Pew, Gallup, Marist, Quinnipiac, ourselves, the Census Bureau, and market research firms all show up, and we do a deep dive and we try to learn from this. We try to learn about changes in the demographics. We try to learn about new emerging methodologies like AI and depth-driven interviews, using text messages to invite people to take surveys online. How to stop these bot farms and survey taking farms with online non-probability panels, and how to develop a high quality probability panel for survey research. So we are always trying to make it better. We are always trying to try new things, and that is the benefit of the scientific, method. Try to make a hypothesis. Do an experiment. How does it come? And learn from your results. So two things that we did this year that was different that we've done in previous cycles is we first included partial respondents. And Justin, you've probably seen this when you were an interviewer, was if someone hung up after they gave you their answer to the horse race and some of their demographics, we kept them in the survey, which we traditionally did not do in the past. We found that helped us get more of these Trump voters who tended to respond less to polls. So, and also anti-establishment voters on the left as well. So voters who would vote for Jill Stein or RFK or Cornel West or even Harris. So that is one thing that we did. And the other thing we did that was quite, I think, is novel and pretty interesting is we call off the voter file. That's something that we did differently much earlier than a lot of other pollsters. For example, the Ann Seltzer poll still uses random digit dial, the Iowa poll that got it wrong. We use the voter file, but there is quite a bit of voters who either have no phone number associated to their record or have a phone number that is completely inaccurate. Sometimes it's fake digits, 999, 888, 777. Whatever those cases were, what we did is we partnered with a sample provider and we actually enhanced our listed sample they were calling off of by finding people who we can match both on name and address from a higher quality cell phone frame and match it back to the voter file and be able to reach voters who would never have been reachable before. So every day we do poll and we try to learn from it. Every year we do a cycle, we try to learn from it. And at the end of the day, polls are trying to measure the future. Even though we're just a snapshot in time, people try to hold us accountable for predicting who's going to turn out on election day. I mean, we saw that a large hurricane hit North Carolina, and that impacted many polling sites. People had to do more mail voting, maybe had to go to a different site. So there are so many variables and factors. We saw on election day there was Russian bomb threats and other disinformation out there. So pollsters are trying to learn, but also recognize that we are studying humans. We do not have the gratitude, or at least the luck that physicists have of studying the natural world. Humans are finicky. Humans often have conflicted opinions, and humans often sometimes make decisions that are against their best interest. So polls are a nice tool. They're a good indicator. But I encourage you, if you would enjoy politics or you enjoy, civic engagement, to get involved, to volunteer, to do some door knocking, do some phone banking, and do the hard work of democracy. Whether you agree or disagree with a poll will not change the results on election day. It's all about us getting involved and speaking up. If people only relied on the polls, even though I think they're a great tool to get politicians to be held accountable, it's really about the boots on the ground action, those marches, the people who put their donations, their dollars towards initiatives. So an answering and viewing polls is one step of being an engaged citizen, but it is not the entire story. So I hope folks, look at the election, whether they're happy about it or not happy about it, get more involved, learn more about the nuance of polling and its limitations. It's a very powerful tool, but it is not a perfect tool. We're not landing, SpaceX rockets on platforms in the ocean here. We're just trying to make sure that we know what temperature the ocean is.
Well, that's quite a way to end this, I guess. And so with that, we're out of time. So this has been Justin Kenny for WVCR and 88.3 Saint with Travis Brodbeck from SCRI, the Siena College Research Institute. So Travis, thank you again for being with us.
And thank you so much for having me. And Justin, as always, it's such a great time having a chat with you. We always go down all these fun rabbit holes, and I appreciate the stimulating conversation that we had.
Thank you. And for all you out there in Radio Land, have a good one.